everyone, and welcome. Today's video is all about the ribbon corset, which is something that was heavily requested in my 100 years of corset video after I showed it as sort of a bonus corset at the end. Now, ribbon corsets are something that were immensely popular in the 1900s. They were advertised as being lightweight and comfortable, really appropriate for sportswear and activewear, and I really enjoy them because they are a fairly simple and sleek corset that I can actually modernize really easily. It works underneath my modern clothes or even on top of my modern clothes, but it's a great corset if you don't necessarily have the money or the time or the expertise to go into making a full-out couture corset or something with lots of pieces and gores and complicated parts. If you're scared of doing corsets, this might be a good place to start. I'm not saying it's going to be super easy or perfect for everybody. However, it is a fairly simple patterning process. There's even a free pattern out there for a ribbon corset in a graded number of sizes. Now, I do have to specify that it is a modern ribbon corset, and as I discovered, there are some differences between the modern versions and the historic versions. It's not drastic, and so you could probably adjust that pattern pretty easily to fit you. The only downside, which is also an upside to them, is that they are underbust and relatively short, which means that you aren't dealing with the complications of trying to fit over long hips or over your bust, which can be sometimes the most complex part of a corset for certain bodies. But it also won't provide you bust support, and it won't necessarily smooth out your tummy area if that's something else you're going for. So there are pluses and minuses to the simplicity of this corset, but I really enjoy making them, and I find them far less complex than lots of other historical styles, especially when you're looking at 1900s S-bend corsets, where that's a fairly complex and compound shape, lots of curves and lots of places, and it may not necessarily match with your own body curves. And if that's an era you really want to do, but you are incredibly daunted by the S-bend corset and don't want to just go buy one, then perhaps the ribbon corset is a good place to start. The first ribbon corset that I made, which you saw in my corsets video, was actually made off of a blog post of instructions by Sydney Eileen. And it's a great place to start, and it has a lot of wonderful tips and tricks in it. But as I noted, there is a bit of a difference between modern and historical ribbon corsets. So, knowing that that was very likely, I first went and did a bunch of research into ribbon corsets to sort of find out how far they went in terms of the era when they were used, how the shape and the construction was done. So I went and looked at museum examples, which the Met has a lot, but unfortunately they also only have pictures of them on mannequins from the front. So you're only getting half the story at best, and that's... So I managed to find a few examples that were laid out flat, or at least showed the front and the back. My particular favorites for this were one corset from Kent State and another one from the MFA Boston. So they actually had them laid out flat, and Kent State actually even had a ruler next to it, which is like glorious. Please, museums, do that for these simple things more often. That helped so much in figuring out proportions and the back versus the front, because that's where I started to notice the difference. Now, I was looking more specifically at ones that sort of sandwiched themselves into that 1900 to 1910 period. I did find research that shows them at least as early as 1898, and I also found references as late as 1920. Could go later than that, but that's a pretty broad range, and I actually found a really great example of a 19-teens ribbon corset, and it's so cool to see one with all of that length. That's not what I really expected to find as a ribbon corset, but super neat. So I kind of focused in on that golden age of ribbon corsets with the short peaked front that didn't cover the bust or support the bust at all, because that got a little bit more complicated, and I didn't want to do that for this time around. I may do that in the future, not this time. I started off by working on the pattern. I'm going to walk you through the drafting of that because I think that's sort of the really important part of this. The construction techniques are fairly simple, but the actual patterning and drafting of the corset is really where I had to experiment a bit and try and figure out the best way to fit my body, but thankfully you only have a few pieces, only 2 of which are curvy, so there's only so much variation that you can put into it. The first step in drafting is pretty much the easiest. We're going to start by drawing out the front, side, and back panels. Now all of these are parallel, and the width of them is dependent on the width of your ribbon. The front piece, for example, will be no more than half of your ribbon width. The middle panel is usually the full ribbon width. There is an exception if you say have a particularly wide ribbon. The first ribbon corset I did, I ended up narrowing it down. Ideally, you're looking for something around 2.5 inches. Maybe up to 3, but certainly not larger than that. The back is also done as a full width panel, just like the side, so that gets marked out for the full width of your ribbon. This is one of the things that I noted on the antiques that was slightly different than many of the modern versions. They had the back panel be narrower and only half the width of the ribbon, whereas most of the antiques that I could find showed a full width of the ribbon. Next, we need to decide on the length of each of these panels. Of course, your front panel is based off of the length of your busk. In this case, I was using an 11-inch busk. They seem to mostly have busks between 10 and 12 inches, but that is a personal preference thing. Just make sure that it doesn't go up so high as to cut into your breastbone, or so low as you can't sit down. For the side panels, I found that proportionally, this meant, because of my 11-inch front, that it should be somewhere around 7 or 8 inches. I also found that the bottom of the side panel was angled slightly, and that was something else that was different than the modern pattern I had used previously. For the back, it has a little bit of a curve to it, being narrower on the inside and wider on the back. I found that the internal shortest area has to be no wider than 3 widths of your ribbon, and overall it ended up being about 75% of the total length of your busk front. Next, we get into shaping out the actual complex curvy pieces. And then I went along and figured out my measurements for my underbust, my hip, and for my waist, and I figured about a 1-inch gap in the back would be ideal. And then I measured out how wide all of those panels added up to be. I then could figure out how wide that front side panel really needed to be, keeping in mind that the center back panel is much wider, so I can't evenly split the difference that is left over. I found that I needed about 7 inches total in the waist, and I ended up putting 3 3/4 in the front and 3 1/4 in the back, so about a 1/2 inch difference between the front and the back. For the underbust area, there was also a slight difference in proportion there. Part of this came from the fact that, from what I could tell, the side panel on these corsets was tilted ever so slightly, with it being further towards the back at the top and further towards the front at the bottom. So that meant that I wanted to add more to this front panel at the underbust. So I ended up going again a little bit over halfway, and when it came to the hip, I started off trying out splitting it evenly. I knew that I was likely going to have to put more towards the back than the front, partly because of my body shape, and you might find that this is even more extreme depending on where you hold that width. I then drew out a curve and compared the length of the side panel to the length of that curve to figure out where the top and bottom needed to be. At this point, I was evenly splitting where that waist was for the front panel, so that makes figuring out the length of this fairly simple. I then redrew the curve slightly so that way I wasn't losing width at the top and the bottom. From there, I drew out the angle between the 2 points, and that gave me a first version of my front piece. For the back piece, it's a very similar process. However, I went ahead and curved the back seam. I know that my back is particularly curvy, and it seemed to also be curvy on the originals, even though it's kind of hard to tell when they're laid out flat. So I went ahead and put in a little bit of a curve there, figuring I can adjust to that later. I then figured out how much was missing from the waist, the underbust, and the hip, and then drew in those measurements. I also at this point realized that I really didn't like how extreme the curve on the front was, and the fact that the back was so straight. I figured this might end up giving me problems. I know that I carry a little bit of weight in my upper back, and I don't carry a lot of weight in my upper front, so I went ahead and took a little bit off of the front panel and added it to the back panel. I also went along and double checked the width of my ribbon to make sure that I hadn't accidentally made my back panel a little bit too long, which I had just ever so slightly. So I had to change up the center back panels as well as that side back length to fit more correctly. For the mock-up, I went ahead and did it out of a stiff cotton. I didn't use a coutil because I didn't have any extra around, so instead I tend to use either a very stiff cotton canvas or anything else that's non-stretchy but sturdy material. I also went ahead and added strips the size of my ribbon to the top and the bottom of both the side front and the side back panels, simply because when they're cut on the angle like that, they're technically cut on the bias, and I figured those might stretch a little bit, so I wanted to make sure that I had straight grain pieces to keep the top and the bottom of the corset from stretching when I was trying this mock-up on. What I found was that the back was a little bit too tight at both the hips and the top. I was kind of feeling snugness over the hips and I was squishing out of the top. There was extra in the hips at the front, so I knew that I needed to readjust that curve slightly. I also recognized that I could probably pull the waist in slightly. I was having trouble actually getting this mock-up laced, mostly because of the way that I laced up the back, so it's not laced as tightly as it could be, which I do adjust in the second mock-up. Overall, I felt like that side panel could have been at slightly more of an angle, and so that's what I ended up adjusting in the pattern, sort of tilting the top further back and tilting the bottom further forward. The adjustments that I made were to narrow in the hip and the waist of the front while making the top a little bit broader, so that way that side panel sits further back. And then for the back, I widened out the hip, took in the waist slightly, and then widened out the top. I also readjusted that position of the back panel because it felt like it was sitting a little bit too low and I was squishing out over the top too much. So for the second mock-up, it felt like it was positioned much better. I didn't have a bunch of excess in the front. The back didn't feel nearly as tight, and overall that brought the waist in, but it didn't feel more constrictive. The height of the back panel was also better, sitting up a little bit higher, meaning that I wasn't getting the squish out factor due to it being too low and too tight. So that was much more comfortable, and because I laced up the corset with the rabbit ears in the middle, I was actually able to get it laced up much more appropriately. It did make me realize that in the future, my lacing panel probably needs more grommets in it just to be able to accommodate some of my smaller corsets, since I move this lacing panel around from mock-up to mock-up, so that way I don't have to put grommets in every single mock-up. I also wanted to compare my new pattern to my old pattern. As you can see, the side back is a little bit more narrow, but that's because the actual back panel is a little bit more wide. I added a little bit more space to both the hips and the underbust area, which makes sense as this is an older corset and I needed to adjust for some size changes. I then drew out where the ribbons were going to be overlapping on the pattern, so that way I could apply that to my ribbon. I knew that I had a very limited quantity of ribbon. I actually had slightly less than 5 yards, which, if you're doing this, I definitely recommend having at least 5 yards, possibly more, but that really obviously depends on your size. However, I personally, with a corseted waist of around 27 inches, needed about 5 yards. So I was just squeaking by and wanted to make sure that I used every single piece of that ribbon that I could. Next up, I started to lay out the ribbon pieces on the corset pattern itself, using that as a reference point. In doing this, I found one frustrating thing. I could have pulled the fabric that I had used for my mock-up, or cut a new piece of fabric, just in case that one had stretched, and pin the ribbons to that. However, this silk satin ribbon did not like being pinned through. Instead, what I did was move to using these little toothless clips, which I had been recommended years ago for use in millinery, and I was able to essentially clip my ribbon pieces to each other and to the pattern itself, which meant that they weren't going to shift around and move on me as I basted the edges. You need to baste your edges so you know where you need to actually stitch. I recommend doing this over chalk or over pencil lines or anything like that, just in case you need to adjust it later. You probably should leave a little more seam allowance than I did, but some of that's going to need to get clipped away to deal with those curves anyway, so there's only so much that you can have in terms of seam allowance. There are a lot of ways to put in a busk, and I highly recommend testing out and trying a whole variety of options. My preferred method is to not cut open the external fabric because then you have a raw section open for the tabs there. I will, however, do that on the coutil layer. What I choose to do instead is usually put a seam along that edge. Since I don't have an extra length of ribbon to seam to itself and chop off a good portion of it, I went ahead and put the seam a little bit off center, so that way the external part of the busk will be fully covered by the ribbon and the internal part will just be about ½ an inch short. That's fine because the cotton sateen that I was using on top of the cotton coutil was going to hide that and sort of finish off the inside nicely. So that allows me to still insert those tabs through that seam. There's no raw edges showing on the outside, and as you can see, the inside is just a little bit offset, but it will still be caught down by the machine stitching that I have to do to keep the busk in place. Now for the other side of the busk, I try to not actually cut open a hole for the buttons. Instead, what I will do is use an awl. Now I have discovered that it is sometimes hard to get an awl through coutil, especially multiple layers of coutil or through cotton sateen, so I went ahead and did each layer individually and then put them together, which meant that because of the way the ribbon works, I didn't have to open up that hole nearly as large as I did on the coutil to get the little button through. I realized that though there were spaces that could accommodate bones at the front, the sides, and the backs, they didn't always have them there. So there were only 4 bones at the side, though there could have been space for 6. And same thing went for the back and the front. They had the space, but they would have had to put in an extra line of stitching to make that boning channel the right size, and they chose not to on multiple versions that I looked at. In part, maybe it's because they didn't want to have 2 lines of stitching that close to each other, and the width of your ribbon really can vary, so you don't always have a way to guarantee that it's going to be the right width for a certain number of bones, and so they just centered up the bones that they needed. Another thing that I noticed about the historic corsets was that the bones were also shorter than the full length. They then stitched little curved scallops at the top and the bottom of the boning, so that way it held them into place. This keeps the bones away from the edges of the corset, which I do find to be more comfortable. There's a little bit of flexibility at the top and the bottom, so you don't have to worry about things digging into your sides or your back.